going on, Alex? How you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. I'm gonna go ahead and get started here in a minute. You like our setup we got? I think you went on mute, Alex. No worries.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Test it one more time because it was coming in a little soft.
Testing. How's that now?
It sounds good, not great. Let's see.
Give me a second here. My voice is a little scratchy, so I apologize. I can
No
put the
worries.
mic down a little bit lower, but I know Nico had said might catch the whiskers a little bit.
Yeah, that's funny. All right, we're just here waiting for Nico. And so for anybody in the audience, we would love for you to join us on Discord, and you can do that. See the clicker at the bottom of the screen, mysuncast.com/community. If you go in there, there's a link actually to hop on stage with us if you have something to add as well during the conversation. So yeah, so let's give Nico another minute here and we'll get started. Hello, sir.
Hey, dudes.
How you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I see.
I was just dropping. Oh, it didn't switch over to my other camera. I was dropping the thing into LinkedIn to let folks know we're going.
So we're streaming live on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Twitter, and right here on StreamYard.
Let's get this magic going. There we go.
It's nice. Cool. I see Joe also hopped in here, so I'll add him to the stream. So he's in the stream with audio only. So Joe, we can probably hear you. Are you there?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
We can. Awesome to have you, man.
All right. Excellent.
Awesome. We'll mute you and then we'll come back to you in a little bit if you have something to add or any questions for Alex. Just let us know. But so yeah, let's go ahead and get started, guys. So we got Alex Stewart here with us today. He's the CEO of carbonblock.io, which I'm really excited to hear more about, as well as StandardCarbon.ai. And he's here to give us a deep dive on carbon offsets. And so yeah, we're gonna kind of roll for about 45 minutes here. We'll let Alex start us off and kind of give us an overview of the whole picture of carbon credits in the background, and then kind of tell us where his businesses fit in and where he sees some opportunities and all that. And then we'll open it up for questions. So there should be a comment box either on YouTube or here in StreamYard. I'll post it there again right now. And so if you have any questions or anything, just shoot them in there and I'll make sure we get to them. So take it away, Alex.
Hey, Alex, before you jump in, I just wanted to ask, because I jumped in late here, did we go ahead and set the premise for office hours? This is the first time we've live streamed. We've been doing it inside our Discord community.
That is true. So
cool.
Yeah, usually we've been doing it in Discord, but the premise is office hours are more of a deep dive into one specific topic with a specific guest. We do them every other week, and then on the opposite week, we do town squares in our Discord community where we just have everyone hang out with each other and kind of get to know each other, tell us about what everyone's working on. So we're here with this new format here for office hours today.
This is our penultimate office hours of the year, and stoked to have Alex. In fact, we just interviewed Alex for the Suncast podcast, asking a lot of these questions. and immediately I thought we really should see if Alex will jump into the community, which he did, and started adding value immediately to our Discord and agreed to do the office hours. There are a bunch of questions that I have, probably repeats from our interview, Alex, just for the benefit of those who are joining. We want to thank everybody that is joining If you're watching on LinkedIn, I just made a post on LinkedIn with the link to how you can join inside our the platform we're actually using called StreamYard and ask your questions, and we can see them if you text them to us from either YouTube or LinkedIn. If you just join the chat there just to ask a question, we can ask it. But if you actually want to join us live, like Joe is doing, and Matt, myself, Alex, then you can do that as well. The link is in my most recent LinkedIn post, and I'm going to see if I can push it out here, but it usually only pushes it out to YouTube. All right. All yours, Alex.
Right on. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat here. Excuse me, just getting over the cold. I think what might be best is to sort of set the stage for what a carbon offset is, what to do, and then get into the weeds a little bit. And so, I want to preface this with, when you hear the terms a carbon market, there isn't a market the same way you have a market for, let's say, baseball cards on eBay or stocks like the New York Stock Exchange. There isn't a clearly well-defined centralized marketplace where you bring buyers and sellers together and you've got price discovery. It's a very opaque system, unfortunately, which I think is part of what's keeping it from scaling, to the extent that it needs to. And so, a carbon offset is meant to bridge the gap between the cost of incumbent technology that has economies of scale, market adoption, all that sort of thing, the efficiencies that go along with being an incumbent, and bridge the gap between the price of the incumbent technology and whatever the new decarbonization technology that is coming to market is providing. And so it's meant, a carbon offset doesn't exist without that requirement for the additional funds. And that's actually one of the key features of a carbon offset that's referred to as additionality, which is sort of a carbon offset specific term that has a bit of circular reasoning in it, but it essentially boils down to, would this greenhouse gas reduction have occurred without additional carbon market dollars? And if it would have occurred just on business as usual, just because of the economics of it, or because some other regulator has come in and regulated that activity, then there's no place for that carbon offset. And so that's really what a carbon offset is meant to do, is to accelerate decarbonization, because it takes dollars from the carbon offset marketplace, carbon dollars, and pushes it to these greenhouse gas reduction projects, which could be anything from ag-related or some other kind of new technology that's coming to bear, and everything sort of under the sun in that regard. Now, how an offset actually gets made, I want to kind of tease that out a little bit, just so that we can level set there. It starts with a greenhouse gas reduction project that ultimately needs to have a validation conducted under ISO 14064-2, which is the ISO standard that kind of governs the creation, the birthing of carbon offsets. And so that validation is a forward-looking estimate of future greenhouse gas reductions. So let's take an ag example where you've got a dairy collective, and they've said, look, we're going to switch to from diesel trucks that take our product to the food producer, and we're going to switch that out to electric. So just as an example, and it's a co-op, and so there's 10 farms, 10 ag producers that participate in this. What'll happen is that claim needs to get written, and typically speaking, the dairy collective, is not going to have the expertise, and so they would engage a consultant to write that, what's referred to as a claim, or sometimes it's called an environmental information statement. And that claim then goes to a verification validation body, which conducts an audit on that. And that validation is the forward-looking estimate for what future reductions are going to be. That gets done, and then at that point, at least in the Vera experience, and Vera is the largest voluntary carbon offset marketplace, so you'll hear me refer to them quite a lot. That's where we've got the bulk of our experience. And so that project gets listed on Vera and saying, over the next 10 years, here's what we expect to have as reductions. You at that point can sell those offsets on a future delivery basis, similar to another kind of commodities, right? Where you're going to say, okay, over the next X period of time, over X cadence, over whatever it happens to be quarterly or annually, we're going to deliver carbon offsets under this contract. So that can actually sort of preempt the actual greenhouse gas reduction and generate capital that can then get invested into whatever that project happens to be in order to get off the ground. Then at a set time later in the future, typically a year, what's done then is a verification gets done. And so there's a monitoring report that gets put together to say, back in the start of 2022, we expected to do the following in 2023. We got to the end of 2023, and here's what we actually did. Here's what we actually achieved. That claim, again, gets written by the consultant and then goes to an auditor to get verified. So there's a validation, forward-looking estimate, verification, rear-facing confirmation of details. Once that verification has been conducted, that's the moment that the serial numbers are created. And those serial numbers get registered on the greenhouse gas program, VERA. And those serial numbers, each serial number represents 1 ton reduction or sequestration of carbon, or its equivalent. And so a carbon offset is a serial number that's held on a greenhouse gas registry that has been verified as a greenhouse gas reduction has already occurred. And so then at that point, it's available for sale, and someone can either buy it from a speculation point of view, or they can purchase it for their own usage and then retire it. And that retirement is where the black pen comes out and strikes out that serial number, and then that ends the life of that carbon offset because someone has now claimed credit for it. And so that's sort of the carbon offset creation process that you kind of have to go through in order to create these carbon assets. So I hope that kind of sets the stage for the conversation here. And kind of want to pass it back to Matt or to Nico.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, Alex, right away for me is there a difference in quality between carbon offsets? Like, does each project, is there a level system or something with carbon offsets, or are they all kind of equal?
It's a very, very good question. There is a new, well, not new, but there's a ratings agency that is coming to market. The company is called B0 Carbon. BEZERO Carbon, B0 Carbon. They're out of London. They've actually just received like a $54 or $56 million Series B raise, and they provide ratings on carbon offsets. So similar to a Moody's or an S&P would rate bonds, they are now rating carbon offsets. And so you've got AAA, AA plus, that kind of rating system, and they go through the various elements that go into the creation of a carbon offset. So we are starting to see independent ratings agencies able to provide that level of context to say, this is a better carbon offset than this one. This one has more likelihood of being successful or being permanent or having other additional social benefits to it as well. And so that's, so to answer your question, yes, that is starting to come into the marketplace.
That's really cool. Awesome. Appreciate that. I'll kind of see if Joe or I saw Angel also just joined us here. So Angel, I just added you and so if you guys have anything to add real quick, let us know. And if not, we'll swing it back to Nico and see if he has any questions. Joe or Angel, anything on your guys' end?
I guess I know there's a couple of marketplace contenders, and being the Web3 enthusiast, I know there's a couple of carbon related projects out there trying to bring the transparency, and I know there's been some controversy maybe with some of their I'll just say their quality of the projects that they brought on chain, as they would say. So it'd be interesting to see what maybe your thoughts, Alex, on the technology as a whole and maybe its role in validating and providing some of that transparency for maybe some of these rating agencies and others to qualify how good or bad certain credits are.
Yeah, and certainly a fairly complex question, so I'll do my best to unpack that. We have seen a variety of those marketplaces ourselves as well. Because a carbon offset is data, it is very well suited for being on chain, whether that's as a specific token or if that's just the data is held on chain. So it's very well suited for that, and being on chain very much helps around the issues of double spend, which was obviously the initial thesis for the Bitcoin white paper. And so that double spend issue is very real in carbon offsets. It's actually been one of the things that's been holding back Article 6 of the Paris Accord, is dealing with the issues around double spend and being listed in multiple places and getting sold to multiple parties. Where I think those sort of blockchain-based marketplaces have struggled is to get the asset itself on chain, because it doesn't necessarily replace the very high friction elements of the manual processes that go into auditing and creating that offset, because at this time the ISO standards that govern the audit do not contemplate the use of blockchain technology and that sort of thing. And so I think there's a case where the underlying standards haven't really caught up with the technology. And so that's part of the gap there, is that sort of right now the only uses that we've seen have been going to purchasing offsets off of Vera and then putting them on chain. And the thing is that those offsets already exist in Vera's ecosystem. And so they're not necessarily driving any additional value at that point. I think once you start to get into issues around sort of the Oracle problem and actually dealing with some of the automation around the audit, that's where I think you're going to start to see some additional value being generated from the three.
I appreciate you guys all jumping in as well. Joe, thanks for that question. Alex, I'd like to ask two particular questions. There's sort of the broader climate view. How do we address ESG? How does carbon fit into that? So I have a question from a pull versus push perspective, but also I want to follow around, or if you want to integrate it in, many listening or watching are familiar with what are referred to as renewable energy credits. And so I'd like to make a distinction between renewable energy credits and carbon credits or carbon offsets if we need to do that. But the primary sort of anchor question is, as we come into 2023, thinking about trends and the scale of carbon credits and how they help empower a renewable revolution, a clean energy revolution, a transition off of fossil fuels, do you see what are the mechanisms you see creating both viability and scalability of the marketplace? Things like large centralized procurement agencies, Walmart, Targets, et cetera, requiring scope 1, 2, 3 emissions offsets. Are there other elements from a regulatory policy perspective? So if you could clarify SRECs versus credits, or like solar RECs or just renewable energy credits versus carbon credits, and also then where do we see the big drivers coming from?
Okay, so I'll do my best with that question, Nico, and then for the parts that I miss, let's circle back on this. So a renewable energy credit, a REC or an SREC, the solar related ones, those each REC represents 1 megawatt of renewable energy. So typically, like, we'll buy power from the utility in kilowatts. So if you look at your utility bill, it would be in kilowatts. But when utilities sell to each other, or there's transmission, it's either dealing in megawatts or gigawatts, that sort of scale. And so 1 REC equals 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy. The issue with that in comparison to a carbon offset or carbon credit is that it doesn't take into account what it's displacing in terms of, like in California, for example, there's so much solar that REC really doesn't have a lot of additional reductions in carbon, depending on the time of the day that it's being used or generated in. And so, whereas a carbon offset, is we've done this, therefore we've reduced pollution. Now, the creation process between a REC and a carbon offset is vastly different. And I think a lot of that's reflected in the pricing as well, where RECs could go for a couple of dollars, whereas carbon offsets are going to be 12, 15, 20, and then beyond that as well. And so there's they're meant to do different things. I think RECs were very good at getting started down this process because they were a financial mechanism that could be used to stimulate additional renewable energy deployment. I think where that falls down now is where it's not displacing additional carbon, like fossil fuel type electricity. And so there's this need to decarbonize the electrical system without question. But the REC is sort of an ill-fitting mechanism for that because it doesn't, for example, you can't capture the value that comes from storage, right? It's not a clean line for that. And I was reading one of the things that you had put out in terms of storage being, I think that was the Thanksgiving Day reading list, was that storage, distributed storage especially, is very critical going forward. And the REC doesn't have a financial mechanism to tie into that. So did that kind of touch on everything you were after, Nico?
Nico, you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you. I rarely do that. Yeah, it does on the REC side, comparing it as a mechanism. And then the follow-on question to that was, where do you see the big drivers coming from? We've got centralized procurement processes that sort of are mandating scope 1, 2, 3. I think we may want to touch on what that means if folks are unclear of scope 1, 2, and 3 and ESG and all that stuff. Like we get into all that in the podcast episode, so I have to be careful of what I assume the audience knows. But I'd like for you to touch a bit on what are the pieces of what are the market mechanisms that drive the use of carbon credits and the usefulness of them.
Got it. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, when we use those terms, relates to what kind of greenhouse gas emissions a company is creating. And scope 1 emissions are best understood as those things directly under the company's control. So the easiest thing to think about would be like a company vehicle. If I fill that company vehicle up with gasoline or diesel and I drive it around to do something for the company, that is a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions come from what you're purchasing from the utility. So that's the carbon footprint of the electricity that you're buying in order to run your operations. Scope 3 emissions is typically speaking things within your supply chain or typically stuff that's out of your control. So for example, employee commuting or executive travel are also considered scope 3 emissions because your company didn't operate the plane that the 2 executives got on to fly to a conference, but you were responsible for those emissions that go along with that. And so that's sort of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It looks a lot like an iceberg where scope 1 and 2 emissions are easily visible to a company because it's a lot cleaner, whereas scope 3 emissions make up by far and away the largest amount of those emissions, and they represent up to 80% of the company's sort of carbon footprint. Now, sort of the market drivers for what people will use carbon offsets for is that we're going to see usages around achieving carbon neutrality, either for a company or for a specific product line. And so when you hear of a company saying, I want to be carbon neutral by 2050 or whatever that happens to be, they're going to look at their internal emissions, stuff that they control, scope 1 and 2, and then they're going to look to external offsets to reduce the parts of their operations that they can't control. So a good example for that would be, let's say I'm a retailer and all of my retail locations are inside of a mall. So I'm a food vendor, I'm a Cinnabon, or I'm a Foot Locker, or a Lids, or something like that. I don't set my thermostat. I don't get to control what temperature this room is set at. And so I might be able to do all kinds of other reductions in greenhouse gases, but I still can't address a major source of my emissions, which is burning natural gas to generate the heat for my store. And so in that case, that firm may choose to go purchase offsets in order to achieve a reduction elsewhere that they may not otherwise be able to do anything about. Now, where we're seeing that, and you've mentioned Walmart sort of as the biggest example of this, is that they're starting to demand disclosures around carbon footprint of the products that they're buying. And so they've recognized their role as a large retailer, saying, look, if you want to sell to us, you have to tell us what your emissions are. And so some firms that maybe want to be a preferred vendor could go out and purchase carbon offsets to say, look, we recognize that the product we sell you has a carbon footprint. We have gone and eliminated our carbon footprint through the use of carbon offsets. Here's all the evidence. And then therefore, Walmart only has to report a lower or potentially no carbon footprint as that product crosses their threshold and becomes their problem. So everything that we've talked about has all been on the voluntary offset marketplace, and those companies doing things because they want to. Whereas what we're starting to see now is the regulated marketplace is slowly coming in and eating away at where that voluntary marketplace has been. And that's healthy because the voluntary marketplace is where a lot more of the experiments can go. And then the regulator can kind of sit back and go, well, we like this, we don't like this. We're going to adopt this part of it, or we're going to only apply it to this part of the economy and that sort of thing. So we're starting to see that happen, certainly in North America and absolutely in Europe.
Awesome, Alex. That's awesome. Thanks so much for that. I just wanted to really quick, we got a question from the audience, so I'll pop it on screen here. Kind of a cool feature of StreamYard. So it says, if you look at countries like India, although the emissions in absolute terms are high, per capita emissions are much lower than the global average. So is there a way to normalize credits based on per capita emissions?
I think that I think it misses the point of the carbon offset insofar as the atmosphere doesn't really care where it comes from. The atmosphere doesn't really care about the per capita emissions intensity. And that is an extremely Western, point of view. And so I recognize that. And I sincerely apologize, because this is where I think you get into issues around sort of climate, justice and that sort of thing, where we are now looking at developing countries saying you have to reduce your emissions. However, they're still looking at developing within many of these other countries to get to that standard of living that they're striving for. And so I think what is a better way to ask that question would be, how do we take these corporate offset dollars and use it to help to drive some of these development initiatives? And so it's almost co-opting corporate carbon dollars as a means of supplementing foreign aid, which is an extremely powerful thing to take a look at. But now all of a sudden you put capitalists and environmentalists on the same side of the table saying, look, if we can go out and take a coal plant offline by doing X, Y, and Z attached to that, and yet we as the company in the West get to beat our chest and pat ourselves on the back, is that really a bad thing? Because there's cleaner power over there, improved air quality, improved agricultural outputs, all that other kind of stuff that goes along with more of that renewable energy, jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the credit is being claimed by a Western corporation that may not necessarily have the otherwise connection back to that developing country. And so I'm not necessarily wanting to wade into the moral imperatives of what I'm getting at, but I think that's a better way to look at carbon offsets coming from developing countries, as a means of sort of, like I said, supplementing that with a direct focus on the carbon emissions. Again, global carbon emissions, because the atmosphere doesn't really care where it comes from.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks, Samir, so much for your question. It's really cool to get the perspective, the global perspective always. So let's shoot it over to Angel real quick. I know Angel has a question as well.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Alex, Nico, Matt, Joe, and everybody that's looking to us here. Just have a question. Thank you for explaining about the renewable energy credits. Uh, kind of understanding how that relates to carbon credits. But can you have, if there's a market for RECs, have that benefit and also get the benefit of carbon credits in another place? Is that possible? Like double whammy is possible to do that?
Yeah, it goes against sort of the ethos of a carbon offset, and you get into the exact issues around double counting, and sort of the. I think the better way to define that is that a REC or a carbon offset both represent an environmental benefit. You can't count that environmental benefit in two separate places. Now, if that environmental benefit also has a reduction in carbon, that the carbon offset is likely going to be more valuable than the REC is going to be. And again, I think the RECs were really good at bringing into the corporate mind eye that they can now turn their purchasing decisions into improvements in the environment. I suspect over time RECs will be phased out in favor of carbon offsets. Would be sort of my gut feeling on that.
Okay, good. That's good. So I need to decide which one would be better. And after I decide, then I need to stick to that until the end. I cannot switch back and forward. Oh, this month I want this, or this other month I want the carbon credits. I don't know. I'm just asking aloud.
Yeah, it's I mean, yes, you can switch back and forth, but there's more of a process to it involved in that, where if you're going to go down the carbon offset route, there's a whole structure around that. And then if you wanted to end that carbon offset project and go to a REC, you can do that. However, it's not really as clean then to go back, like to switch back and forth. So if there was a decision to change direction, yes. However, like I said before, the process is very high friction. And so you're going to lose a lot of the value just getting tied up in all the consultants that need to get involved in the paperwork and then the audits and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A REC is easier to create and tends to sell for a lower price. An offset, more complicated, so it costs more to create, but will generate a higher value dollar. Um, and so I think that's kind of the better way to look at it, is just which path is better for the project. The other thing that comes up, especially around renewable energy, is that the decision has been made at a political level, and that's small p political, not elected officials political. The decision was made by Vera and the other greenhouse gas programs to exclude renewable energy in developed countries, because the argument goes that the unit cost for the renewables is on par with now those fossil-based fuels. So there was a decision. So you can't take a U.S. renewable project and go to Vera and create a Vera carbon offset in 2023. You cannot do that. Now, I think that misses the point in a lot of different ways, but I'm not the one making those decisions. However, I do know, certainly in Canada at least, that we're still building new natural gas plants. We're still building new, fossil fuel burning electrical generating stations. And so that argument kind of falls apart, I think, at that point. Certainly in Canada, we have 300 First Nations communities, Indigenous communities that are never going to get connected to the grid, that only run on diesel. And so that diesel has to be trucked up either on a winter road or brought in by plane. And so that's 300 communities of varying sizes, from a couple hundred people to thousands of people, that only run on diesel generators. 300 across northern Canada. I don't think there's any off-grid communities in the mainland U.S. There may be in Alaska, but there's an example that would directly benefit the greenhouse gas reductions, but you can't create a carbon offset because it's within a developed country such as Canada. However, we're looking at the Canadian North, which frankly would be quite undeveloped in comparison. So there's a bunch of that other stuff that goes on in the background as well, just to consider. If you're looking at specific project financing, we should have a chat about, some of the nuances that are there.
Thank you, Alex. Go ahead, Matt.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate that. So, Alex, I think it'd be cool now to kind of shift back to your story a little bit and kind of hear more about what role Carbon Block plays and what role Standard Carbon plays, if you're cool with that.
Yeah. So Carbon Block was founded in 2018 as a project originator. And so we had the intent on developing technology to speed up the carbon offset creation process. And actually, we got started in solar because that was our background. And so we kind of thought, look, all of these folks are installing solar. How could we drive additional value to those solar customers? And they are reducing greenhouse gases, and from a local utility. How do we capture that so that we can give them more value for that, and ideally get more distributed solar, improve that adoption rate. And so we sort of started down that path, and we actually have produced the technology. It's in prototype right now, that actually takes a unit of solar electricity and takes that, processes it, and then actually stores the information on chain. And so we have created carbon offsets on chain from a solar array right now. That was on the Ethereum test chain, so they're not registered carbon offsets, but they do represent a 1 ton reduction in greenhouse gases. And so that was sort of carbon offsets sort of birth. And when we discovered this prohibition on renewable energy projects in developed countries, we started looking at projects in the developing countries, which is the 46 least developed countries, as identified by the United Nations. Is the only place that we can do this. And so we started looking at those types of countries in order to find solar projects for us to then apply our technology in. And along the way, we started to get asked by actually a lot of ag-related organizations in terms of being able to participate in their greenhouse gas reduction projects. And so Carbon Block is now a project originator in the legacy fashion, generating offsets from some ag projects and then some projects in Africa as well. And so I want to take a break there for a second, put myself on mute, have a little bit of cough, and grab some water. So I apologize, I'm going to have to pass it back to you guys.
Yeah, man. No worries at all. That's awesome. Nico, any thoughts there?
The reason that I brought Alex on to Suncast is because I think that not only myself, but a lot of people don't understand the technical details of how this works. This is one of those classic inside the box, behind the veil kind of aspects of the market that is, it's nebulous. It's even obfuscated. People call it greenwashing. And I think that's one of the things that we definitely touch on in the podcast episode with Alex, that it can in fact be greenwashing. And that's one of the reasons why Carbon Block and Standard Carbon are technology focused, so that we can identify exactly what it means to account for the carbon offset. One of my favorites, and I'd love for you to give this example, Alex, is Alex told me when we first met, a carbon offset is proving a counterfactual, akin to how would I prove that to you that I never climbed Mount Everest, right? And it takes a minute. Like think about that. It's instead of I climbed Mount Everest and here's the photo, it is I didn't climb Mount Everest. How do I prove that? And that's the equivalent of what we have to try and document. Alex, something that that for me is still a little bit complex is there's this notion of registry, right? Like we were just talking about how we account for it. How do we actually have a ledger where it is written down? And in the carbon offset market, my understanding is there's a known quantity, less than 5 companies, who sort of control this idea of the ledger upon which carbon offsets are written down and canceled, so to speak. Can you talk about the marketplace for that and maybe expand the conversation into the whole notion of a marketplace for carbon?
Yeah, certainly, and happy to go back to sort of the standard carbon origin story after I answer this question as well, which is where I got cut off by my tail of my cold.
Sure.
And so the greenhouse gas registries, Vera is one that I mentioned already.
Mm-hmm.
These are, again, the voluntary offset registries that I'm referring to. And so there's Vera, Gold Standard, Climate Development Mechanism, CDM. There's also the American Carbon Registry, which is out of, well, it's obviously the US. And then in Canada, we've got the Canadian Standards Association, who is also functions as a greenhouse gas registry. And so those registries perform three functions. They approve projects, they approve methodologies, and then they keep tabs on the serial numbers related to those projects.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the three functions of a greenhouse gas registry. So, for example, you would have, we would go to put forward a project to Vera. They would look at it and go, this is a renewable energy project in Canada. No, you can't do that. We will not register this project. Or they would go and say, okay, we have produced this methodology, and this methodology states that if you do the following things, this is how you calculate your reduction. And so that's the methodology is the recipe that we use to create the carbon offset, for lack of a better term. Let's go out, collect this data, use this mathematical formula, and then here's how you create that offset. And then lastly, that greenhouse gas registry provides the serial numbers, the warehousing, and then the retirement of the serial numbers. It's actually that last part that blockchain is very well suited for. But still, the methodology approval and the project registry still require some human inputs in there. Now, if you think of these registries more as like a bulletin board, where they are just listing the projects and just here's where the project is at, here's the serial numbers that are attached to that project, and then it's just sort of a we just have it all listed on our website. The problem is that we don't see the kind of marketplaces like a stock market that actually engages in price discovery. And as a result of that, you've got a great deal of information asymmetry, meaning the buyers are not really under pressure, around pricing. The sellers don't really have any idea of what they can expect to get, which obviously throws things off when you're trying to finance a project and not knowing what one of your revenue drivers is going to be. And so, we are starting to see more mature marketplaces come to effect. I know Singapore is working on one. The Climate Impact Exchange is one that is trying very hard to bring that kind of price discovery to their.
That's helpful. Appreciate that. Matt, how are we doing on questions? Do you have any comments from the audience?
Sorry, I was on mute there for a second.
No
So
worries.
we had Luis Morales. He might have missed a little bit of the discussion earlier with the blockchain question that Joe asked, but I guess Alex. Well, I know you still have to get to your standard carbon story, and I know you're got a little bit of a cold going, so we don't want to hurt you here. But Luis was just asking if do you see a place for blockchain technology to act as a global ledger and solve the double spend problem? So I guess kind of like from a personal opinion, really quick, is that something you're, as we were saying, in the blockchain world, bullish on, like the crypto and blockchain becoming a big part of this industry? Alex, we can't hear you right now.
How's that? I know.
There you go. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it fixed.
All right.
Nice.
So guys, I apologize.
No
Now
worries.
my boom mic is functioning here. Matt, I apologize. I was busy fiddling with settings and not listening to your question. So could you repeat? I apologize.
It's the question on the screen. There you go.
Oh,
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah. Just
Okay.
back to the blockchain thing. Just kind of, are you bullish on blockchain being a big part of this industry going forward, or do you kind of see it bringing more problems than solutions?
I do. I see it certainly. I'm bullish on the chain for sure. We've developed some technology to facilitate that. We are starting actually the very first use case of blockchain in the industry that's actually done, what it's supposed to do, is a payment rails system that was set up by some of the major banks on each of the continents. I know here in Canada, CIBC was involved. I don't remember. There was a Brazilian bank. There's a bank in the U.S. It was referred to as Project Carbon. It's now they branded it something else. But essentially, what it's meant to do is provide the payment rail similar to the SWIFT payment network. And so that is in fact they've done their first transactions on that payment system. They're actually the ones that are tied in with the Climate Impact X out of Singapore. So, that was, I think, very interesting use case was dealing with the cross-border payment part of it, which I think blockchain is very well suited for. Now, in terms of actually sort of tokenizing the asset, under the underlying asset, I think it gets a lot more complicated in that. We've actually spoken with lawyers about sort of tokenizing the offset and how that would function, and then the transference ownership and all that kind of stuff. Generally speaking, though, yes, I do see blockchain being very well suited for the carbon offset marketplace.
Awesome. Hope that answers your question, Luis. And so, Alex, we'll let you get back to Standard Carbon here. And then, Nico, did you want to swing this back over to Discord, or did you want to just let it roll here for the last 15 minutes in StreamYard?
Yeah, I think right now I see Edu, Joe, Angel. We're all part of the Discord community, at least the ones that are here on the stage. And I think that, I mean, if we want to try like going back over, there's nobody right now on YouTube, but it'd be fine to do it. Or we can continue to capture the content here for this week, and we could try to push out to. The idea is eventually do like 30, 45 minutes here and then go back to having a voice chat, like a stage style inside of the Discord community for the last half of the hour.
Yeah, I think for right now, let's just hang here. So to prevent the time, time wasting, and Alex got his mic working good, so we might as well stick here.
Fantastic.
So, so Matt, to answer sort of your question, so Carbon Block created in 2018. And created. We spun that up in order to develop technology to facilitate the carbon offset creation process. As we were going through the steps of how you actually create a carbon offset, we came across, the ISO standard, which actually very clearly delineates the audit process from the underlying value of the offset, and so it's a conflict of interest for you to be the ones counting the offsets and the ones selling the offsets, right? It's fairly straightforward. And that was not expected. And so as a result of that, we created Standard Carbon to act as that auditor. And then ultimately, we received, legal advice in terms of how those two things actually have to be separated. And it looks a lot like how a public practice accounting firm works, where you've got consulting on one side and then assurance or audit on the other. And so we're in the process of doing that right now. But that as Standard Carbon got going, we ended up working with the American Accounting Association, AICPA, and the CPA.com, where they helped us see a much bigger market opportunity than carbon offsets, which is still quite a large opportunity, but specifically around the Securities Exchange Commission climate disclosure rule that was published in March of 2022. And they basically said, we as an accounting profession are going to have a massive problem right here with this law because we don't have the environmental education to sign off on these disclosures, these environmental disclosures. And that's where we kind of said, okay, look, if we develop technology to translate EnviroSci into financial language and then give you guys all the hooks that you need to normally do your audit stuff, Would that be helpful to you? And they, the head of the accounting association looked at me square in the eye and was like, oh my God, that would be huge. Every single accountant who wants to get into this would love to have a piece of software that translates EnviroSci into financial language. And that's really what we've been pursuing at sort of full speed ahead, is the development of that software. You can find more details on climateaccounting.com. And certainly that gets into all of the sort of how you calculate scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, how you get your vendors to report that to you, how you provide that information to your customers as well, because that information needs to flow from farm to table in the case of agriculture, or manufacturing. And so that's sort of what Standard Carbon has been doing. And so it's helpful to think of the carbon ledger with obviously carbon debt and carbon credits. Standard Carbon functions on the carbon debt side of the ledger, and carbon block functions on the credit side of the ledger.
Gotcha. Very cool. Very cool how you're filling the gaps there. Hey, Joe or Angel, did either of you guys have anything else to add? If not, I have one more question myself. Go ahead, Angel.
I have one more question, Alex. So, if there's a new project, what would be the process to get analyzed through one of these financial companies to also include, as part of the financial benefit, the carbon credit, and see this as a whole picture, making the project available? What's the process?
Yeah. So you would need to find a project originator. So certainly Carbon Block could provide that service to you. There are others out there as well. And actually, what we're finding is that in order to maintain our impartiality under the ISO accreditation that we have, we are an ISO accredited company under the Standards Council of Canada, which is the US. The US's equivalent is ANSI or ANAB. And so Carbon Block could get involved and sort of assist with developing all the paperwork, doing the calculations, providing all those kinds of estimates and that sort of thing. What's happening now is that we're not using Standard Carbon. So the reason Standard Carbon was created was to audit Carbon Block's projects. And what we're finding now is that it's not worth it to us from a reputational risk point of view to have those two sort of entities commingle, because there's a lot of complexities that goes into how we actually have to separate the two companies in order to do that. And so Carbon Block would get involved, and then we could assist the project in actually finding a verification validation body, an auditor, to actually do that audit work as well. And then Carbon Block, Carbon Block's main line of business is actually carbon offset brokerage. And so we've got a network of buyers that we would then go and shop the offsets to, and then find either folks interested in purchasing on a future delivery basis to generate cash capital for the project in the startup phase, or then be able to, on a regular basis, deliver the best value for dollar, because we only take a commission on the offset. We don't take ownership of it. So it's not like we'll pay you $10 and go and sell it for 100. We have that same financial interest wherein the more money you make, the more money the Carbon Block makes as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angel. Joe, anything else from you? Are you good? Cool, man. Appreciate you coming up on stage with us. I guess one thing that I've been wondering is as a retail investor, what is the way to, I've heard of investing in carbon as the asset, and so is that a can you kind of break that opportunity down, and is that a good thing to look at as an investor?
So excuse me, full disclaimer, I am not a financial professional.
Of course.
So I'm not licensed or professional to be able to provide that in any way. The only place that I've seen this exposure that a retail investor can get, and I have absolutely no interest in this. So again, full disclosure, I'm not in any way affiliated with this firm, is through Crane Shares, KRANE shares.com. And they have an ETF that is indexed to, I think, the 6 largest carbon offset marketplaces. And so they, forget the stock ticker that they're operating under. they started out as a firm to provide exposure to the Chinese marketplace, the Chinese stock market, but they've also seen carbon offsets as a way to add value as well. So they run an ETF. I believe that ETF returned considerable returns to investors over the last year. And so if you wanted something, again, I mean, an ETF being what it is, if you wanted exposure to the general framework of carbon pricing, and if you think carbon is going to go up in price compared to what it was last year, then this is the only vehicle that I've come across that gives a retail investor that exposure.
Yeah, I just posted it in the comments as well. craneshares.com/KRBN. Gotcha.
Very cool. Cool. Well, we got 5 minutes left, Nico. Anything else on your end?
You know, I like meetings that when 5 minutes is left, you return it to the people. They can go take a bio break and get ready for the next meeting. All I would like to say is I'm really genuinely thankful to not just to Alex, but you, Matt, to Joe, Angel, all the folks, Herman, who've helped make these office hours come to life. Thankful to those who watched it, and to those of you who are watching it now, maybe at 11 o'clock at night on LinkedIn or YouTube. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for joining our community. If you're not already a part of our community, you can see it scrolling across the bottom of the screen right now. We've got hundreds of clean energy and climate enthusiasts jumping into our Discord, dozens a week. You can go to mysuncast.com/community. It's called Resource Labs. Our community manager and growth hacker is Mr. Matt Galley, whose voice you've been listening to if you're only listening to the audio in some other format. Just want to thank all of you guys for joining us once again. We are trying to build something here that is more reflective of our community and a two-way conversation than just a simple podcast often can portray. So last but certainly not least, once again, thank you, Alex, for being a voice of education and reason around how carbon offsets and carbon credits work. I learn something every time I engage with you, my friend.
That's awesome. Real pleasure, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. And hope to see you guys in Discord. Talk soon.
Yeah, we'll see you over in Discord.
All right.